Welcome to the Renaissance Humanism podcast. Today's podcast will be looking at the importance of King Edward I of England. I normally do this because this podcast, I don't just want it to be about business, marketing. I also want it to be about culture, history, and people getting connected with their roots as well. I'm very much a generalist when it comes to knowledge. Not so much that I focus on many subjects, but I focus on many subjects in detail because I believe in order to understand economics, understand marketing, understand culture, understand politics, you need to understand the shared depth of knowledge. There's a great knowledge to actually understand, like the relationship between England and France. This is not just present; it's also historical as well. And I also believe this current period of peace since the end of the Second World War is artificial peace. It's something that's been maintained and developed by the United States during the Cold War, and that enabled globalization, enabled places that could not develop in order to develop, just because rather than spending money in trying to kill your neighbors or secure your borders, states could now spend money on improving their economies. That is what the Americans did. And I believe only by understanding the true depth of history can people truly understand how this time period is an anomaly, which I personally hope will continue, but it is under threat during the next 10 to 20 years if the Americans pull out of the global system, if they go back home. Because globalism doesn't really affect America, purely because of its economies of scale and its internal markets. It can get all its goods within the United States. I believe only 10 to 15% of its actual needs are through imports, unlike some places like England and Germany that are dependent either on foreign labour or importing food resources as well. America, France are food sufficient, unlike the United Kingdom and many other countries around the globe, due to globalisation and specialisation. Now, I hope this helps to explain things as well, just because I said I hope to diversify this podcast and actually develop different streams of content as well, just so people can become more informed, because people's national history tends to be 1945 onwards. We ignore the preceding thousands of years of human history. Okay. Now, King Edward I, he became king in 1272 to 1307. The reason why his reign is so important was because from the death of King Henry II of England, his great-grandfather, in 1189, England either had bad kings, poor kings, or kings that have either failed or were not meant to, who did not have the abilities to be king. Now, Richard the Lionheart, he was king from 1189 to 1199, so he spent over 10 years on the throne. His rule as a warrior king, and as in terms of like personality as well, his ability to get people to support him, it was a phenomenal success. And before his death in 1199, he managed to secure the Plantagenet lands in France. That's going from Normandy, Greater Anjou and Maine, the Aquitaine, Brittany, all the way down to the Pyrenees. So it's more than half of France, which the family actually controlled, with a claim to Toulouse as well. People actually know what France looks like. You'll be able to you'll see what I mean. But during his rule, he fought in the Third Crusade. He took Acre. He abandoned the crusade purely because Philip Augustus was attacking his holdings in France, and he also spent a few years in capture, first by the Austrian dukes, then by the German emperor, Frederick. Was it Frederick? I think it was Henry. German name was Henry. I can't quite remember the name, but he spent a few years in prison as well. I think it was 2 to 3 years, I believe it was. And then he buggered his realm then, actually, to get him back with the ransom, so it weakened the coffers. And towards the end of his rule, he managed to reclaim all his lands that Philip took from him. But that was it. So he was a successful warrior king. He was a successful fighter even in his youth, when he took about, I think it was between 30 or 30 castles he took. during his time putting down a rebellion in the Aquitaine, in the dukedom, which he actually caused by fighting against his own father. But I would say overall, Richard the Lionheart, he was a great warrior king. He was a great king by the standards of his time, but he did fail. He left the kingdom poorer and vulnerable, as well as not providing a heir by not having children. King John, or King John the Bad, or King John Softword, he ruled from 1199 till I believe it was 1207, and then when he died, his son took over. King John, he was a man who signed Magna Carta in 1214 and again in 1215, if I've got those dates correct. Again, he was a poor king. He lost all the continental holdings, lost Normandy, lost Aquitaine, lost most of Gascony, apart from a little place called most of Aquitaine, apart from a little place called Gascony. So he lost all that. And then his son, King Henry III, he was king at the age of 9 years old. He was never trained to rule. He was very much manipulated by his regents, and he very much looking for a father figure, which he never found. He never actually learned to rule, and that was one of his massive defects as well. He was a big dreamer. He wasn't a fighter. He wasn't a warrior king, and he didn't have the personality to rule. He didn't have the skill set. He fought a war in Wales in the 1250s. He fought against France about 2 to 3 times. The last time was in the 1230s, which again he was defeated by Louis IX of France. So he tried to take France 3 times ended in failure, and these repeated failures further weakened his rule and his reputation. Simon de Montfort, one of his barons, he was Earl of Leicester, compared him to Charles the Simple of France, who was deposed and replaced with the first Capetian king, or the Robertians. That was Odo, who ruled for, he ruled for a few years, and then his brother Robert became king, and then their nephew by marriage, Luthor, I believe the name was. No, it was Rollo. Raoul, I believe, was King Raoul. Sorry about that. With this comparison, you can see that he's clearly not seen as a fit man to rule, and things came to a head during the Second Barons' War, because Henry III fell out with his mate Simon de Montfort, due to Simon de Montfort taking out a loan with Henry III as guarantor, guaranteeing his debts because Henry owed him money for when he served for him in Gascony as his sentinel. And because Henry didn't pay him back, Simon just took out a loan and said that Henry III would pay back the money, which he obviously didn't, and he was very angry. There started a big split between both men, which helped to culminate in the Second Barons' War, the First Barons' War happening between King John and his war with his own barons. The Second Barons' War lasted from 1264 to 1267. That's how long the conflict lasted. This is where King Edward I, or Prince Edward, or Lord Edward, as he was actually physically known at the time, just because during this time period titles were still in flux, so they didn't call Edward Prince Edward, they called him the Lord Edward. Now, Lord Edward, he fought with his father at the Battle of Lewes, as well with his uncle Richard, Earl of Cornwall. During that battle, Edward he was facing Londoners, and during the battle he charged with his cavalry to go and fight the Londoners, which he did kill. To understand this, it wasn't just due to the battle; it was also due to Edward having a personal hatred against the people of London in that region, in that region as well, just because during the Barons' War and the dispute between King Henry III and Simon de Montfort, King Edward's mother, Eleanor of Provence, she was stoned and thrown food at her on her barge. She was travelling to the Tower of London for safety, and because of that, Edward I never really got over his hatred over the Londoners. That's why he cancelled their rights and liberties to elect a London mayor, just because he could not stand them. He never really truly forgave them. and this is what cost him the Battle of Lewes, because whilst he was running down the peasants of the Londoners, he left his father's army and his uncle by themselves because he was too busy trying to kill them, rather than swinging round to go and fight the de Montforts. He left his father's army alone, and that's how they got overrun and defeated. Following year, Lord Edward, he escaped captivity, and in 1265 he met Simon de Montfort in battle again, and during this battle he defeated Simon de Montfort. He outmaneuvered him, and he also had a larger army as well. During this battle, Lord Edward, he gave orders to a squad of knights to find Simon de Montfort and kill him and his family. During the battle, Simon de Montfort lost his son's life and his own life due to these knights and the orders to actually kill them. Normally, in this kind of medieval warfare, it's not like Game of Thrones. We expect to die. Knights, they're wearing full plate armor, so they're relatively safe from like spears owned by peasants or pitchforks, or if they're lucky, some knives as well. So the men would say the biggest threat to knights in this period was usually other knights, and they usually fought with poleaxes or hammers, just because those kind of weapons work best against plate armor, not swords. Swords are great against unarmored peasants or people wearing leather armor, not the full plate armor. So what King Edward did, he went against the traditions of the time and ordered these knights to kill him. They didn't just kill him, they cut off his balls and they stuffed the balls, the male genitalia, into his mouth. So once they did that, he went against the traditions of the time, just because they was used as traitors, and because they were traitors, he could get away with doing this. But even then, it was a bit of a shock for the people at the time. This is where, if you're interested, George R.R. Martin got his inspiration for the Reigns of Castamere in his book A Song of Ice and Fire and his World of A Song of Ice and Fire with Westeros. He took the character Tywin Lannister and took some inspiration for him from King Edward I and King Henry III as Tytos Lannister and Tywin Lannister. If you're interested in this, I do strongly recommend looking this up. There's the Yale series of the history of England. You might be interested in as well. That called King Edward I, one of the books. You might find that interesting. There's also another big book called A Great and Terrible King that talks about the reign. It's a biography of King Edward I of England, and it talks about what he did, his character. Again, if you want some more information, if you want a deep dive, I strongly recommend reading those two books. The English Yale series of English monarchs, they're very detailed. It has information on there about the castle building projects in Wales, which you might find more interesting, about the actual finances, the finances of the English crown, some finances of the French crown, and his expenses in all Edward's wars. If you want some more detail, I strongly recommend reading that. And if you're interested, it's King Henry III and King Edward II that inspired George R.R. Martin's creation of Tytos Lannister and Tywin Lannister, if you like that sort of thing. Now, back to King Edward, or Lord Edward, I should say, during this time period. After this battle, he cemented his reputation as a strong warrior, as a future warrior king, and a king in waiting. His father would live until 1272. The last time they would actually physically meet was in 1270, when Edward went on crusade. He spent the next 40 years on crusade in Jerusalem. He spent most of his time in Acre, just because the crusade organised by Louis IX of France in 1270, rather than going to Jerusalem, due to Charles, King of Sicily and Naples, he was also the Duke of Greater Aquitaine. Rather than going to Spain, due to the convincing of his younger brother, who are called to the French are called the Angevins, he went to go and fight in Egypt. That did not turn out well. He died of dysentery. He also lost his brother as well, Alfonso, who was Count of Poitiers, and his own son, the future Philip III, lost his first wife, who was the mother of his three sons, I should say, Louis, who died in childhood, the future Philip IV of France, and Charles, Count of Valois, that would form the Valois dynasty of France after the main line of the Capetians died out. Now, Edward during his time period, he spent his time in Crusade. He famously, assassination attempt was taken on him, and as the myth goes, his wife sucked the blood out of his body to get the poison out. If this did happen, it wouldn't have been his wife that actually took part. More accurately, she would have been taken out of the room, and another knight would have come and sucked him off in order to get the blood out of his system. That makes a very good story. If you're interested, it's a good story. It's not very factual. In case you're wondering, his wife was Eleanor of Castile. She was the daughter of Ferdinand III of Castile. Now, Edward, on his return to the continent, he was back in Europe, mainland Europe, well, Western Europe by 1273, and in that time period, he spent it mostly in France. Spent mostly a year in France, mostly in his own dukedom of Gascony, which used to be part of the dukedom of Aquitaine. So it's pretty much what was left of that great estate of his ancestors. And with that, from there, he spent a year trying to establish royal authority in Gascony. Then he returned to England. Okay, now I'm going to actually break down why his reign was important in broad strokes. King Edward was the first capable king and successful king England had had in nearly 80 years, from the death of King Henry II in 1189 to his coronation in 1274. That's a big gap between actually having a capable king, and I don't believe the dynasty would have survived another king like King John or his own father, King Edward III, who was king for over 50 years. Edward will be king for over 35 years, depending on how you count it, because officially he was crowned, he was king from the moment his father died in 1272, but he was crowned in 1274. Because kings of England, from King Henry III going onward, they weren't kings by coronation, they were kings by acclamation. So the moment the king is dead, it's the king is dead, long live the king. That's why with Queen Elizabeth dying now, recently in the United Kingdom, the moment her heart stopped beating, Prince Charles became King Charles III. So he's king by acclamation, not by coronation. That's something that's happened in that time period. That's when it really happened, because previously the kings of England were made by coronation, not by acclamation. So that's a big difference. Now, what is so important about King Edward was that he, during his lifetime as king, during his rule, he hosted at least over 50 parliaments that we are aware of. He got the parliamentary system working and functioning. Parliament really dates back to the 1250s under his own father's rule, but with the Barons' War, internal instability, it was only really King Edward I when the system truly started working. Before that, the system didn't work. It wasn't functioning. There was chaos between the king and his barons. So that's what's really important as well. Another important factor of King Edward's rule was his conquest of Wales. The thing about King Edward, what makes him so controversial, I would say, for the Welsh and the Scots, that before he actually invaded Wales, he invited Prince Llewellyn, who was the Prince of Wales. He didn't physically rule all of Wales. It was just his title. South Wales was controlled by the Marcher Lords, like Gilbert de Clare and the Mortimer family, as well as other families in that region who controlled the south of Wales. And the other parts of Wales were typically ruled by two or three petty kingdoms. But it didn't necessarily work like that, because the Welsh in this time period had one of the strangest succession laws in the world, because all members of the family, once the head of the family died, the main holder of the holdings, it would all be divided equally between his children's and uncles and other relatives. That means the actual principalities and the kingdom can never actually truly solidify, because the inheritance kept getting divided and divided and divided, making it weaker and weaker. Now, historically, since the time of King Edward the Elder, he was the son of King Alfred the Great, and his son King Athelstan, who was the first king of the English in 927. Under those two people, the kings of Scotland, or Alba, I should say, and also Strathclyde, that was another kingdom that was parts of like Cumberland and southern Scotland, as well as the Principality of Wales, old King Edward the Elder, and then his son Athelstan homage. And this is where King Edward I got his claim from, and also that Llewellyn did perform homage, same as his successors. One of his, I think it was his uncle or great uncle, Prince David, also performed homage to King John of England. So this is where this comes from. Because Llewellyn did not perform the homage, he didn't turn up. It was on the way to actually go and meet King Edward at the time in the mid 1270s, but for some reason he felt threatened for his safety, or for other reasons he just didn't turn up. Because he didn't turn up, King Edward, he launched his first invasion of Scotland. This is an invasion. Over the next 3 wars in the late 1270s, 1280s, and 1290s would be classed as rebellions. Just because when Edward invaded Wales for the first time, he didn't start building his castle work. He just invaded. He got Llewellyn to perform homage to himself and left it. When Llewellyn rebelled in a few years' time, that's when he actually killed the Prince of Wales and conquered the nation in its entirety, just because he needed the legal claim and legal justification to actually do this. Now, from the Welsh language started to disappear. By the 1950s, Welsh was pretty much a dead language. It's coming back now to a bit due to a bit of nationalism and globalization and a lot of other political stuff, but the language, next few centuries, the language started to die out. So that was one of the longest standing legacies of King Edward. His other legacy would be his war with Scotland. See, for Edward to actually invade Scotland, when Alexander III of Scotland died, I believe it was in 1289. I think it's 1289 when Alexander III of Scotland died. The Scottish laws invited Edward in to actually help choose the next king of Scotland. There was John of Holland, John Balow, if I'm saying that name right, and Robert the Bruce. This is the senior. This is Robert the Bruce. This is Robert I of Scotland's grandfather. Now, all these 3 men had a claim through the line of King David the First of Scotland, and through one of his sons who became the Earl of Huntingdon, Henry of Huntingdon. That's where the claim came from for those 3 kings. Robert the Bruce Senior, he wanted the kingdom to be divided into 3 separate kingdoms. John Balow, he had the greatest claim through the eldest daughter, and then there was John of Holland, who actually had the middle claim. Or the 3rd claim? One of those 2 anyway. So obviously Scotland wasn't divided. They invited King Edward in to actually mitigate, but in order for this to happen, the Scottish nobility had to perform homage to King Edward. The problem with this, some of them was reluctant to perform homage, but legally, in order for King Edward to actually pass a judgment on the next king of Scotland, they would have to perform a homage of fealty to him. And because they performed this homage, they also gave their loyalty to King Edward, first and foremost. And because of this, it gave him legal precedent to actually dictate or make laws in Scotland. But legally, in order for him to make a decision, they would have to make Edward the Lord of Scotland. in terms of homage and law in order for any ruling that he makes to be legal. So he chose King John Bailo as the King of Scotland. This king, he had problems making the transition from a earl to a king, like King Stephen and his war with his cousin Empress Matilda. Like them, he never made the transition from lord to king successfully. So his lords never really expect him, because he was a son of a lord, not the son of a king. So why should they really obey him? And because of this, his authority started to be questioned, and there was internal rebellions. And then what really happened in the mid-1290s, King John of Scotland, he made a deal with Philip IV of France, sorry about that, which created the Allude Alliance. That would be an alliance between the kings of Scotland and the kings of France that will last until the 16th century. This alliance was a direct threat to King Edward's kingdom, because at this time he was also fighting Philip IV of France over his continental holdings, because Philip IV, he wanted the King of England out of France. That's the long story short. And because he took the possessions away from Edward had to fight a continental war with France, which mostly took place on the southern coast of England, Gascony, Flanders, and he had an alliance with the princes and lords of the Holy Roman Empire, which is modern day Germany and northern and central Italy. During this conflict, King Edward, he left his treasury. I think he had it was £400,000 in debt, just through the expense of all the bribes he had to pay in order to get the support from the German princess and to build a coalition to actually fight the King of France, whose annual revenue was £100,000 a year, who was a lot more richer than the King of England's, whose revenue usually averaged around £15,000 to £220 a year. That's depending, unless he gets grants from Parliament to raise money from taxing the wool trade, as well as movables and transport as well, which needed the support department to actually pay for. Now, what this conflict last created was a legacy of war and violence between the kings of England, Scotland and France that will persist until the 18th century and early 19th century, with the Scotland finally being truly brought into the Kingdom of England with the creation of the United Kingdom, and the defeat of Napoleon during the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. Some historians might argue that the rivalry between England and France has never really ended. Others would argue that it was the last big conflict between England and France. It all depends on your own interpretation. Now, this legacy obviously led to nearly 500 years of on and off conflict or more between England and France. But in this period, that conflict helped to contribute to the 100 Years' War that was fought between Edward I's great grandson from 1337 to 1453, between the Plantagenets and Valois dynasties. And obviously that's a big legacy. And the other big legacy was the animosity created between England and Scotland with the 30 Years' War fought between the kings of England trying to conquer Scotland. King Edward I, by 1305, actually subdued Scotland, but there was a rising in that year that removed all his hard work. King Edward, he ran out of time to conquer Scotland, and his son, King Edward II, was inept, he wasn't capable, and his grandson, King Edward III, he did take the lowlands of Scotland for a time, but he was more focused on a war with France for control over the French throne and the old Plantagenet possessions, because they were a lot more valuable than taking Scotland. So I hope I've been clear today with this. I know there's a lot of information, there's a lot of talk to unpack. I've tried to do this as brief as possible. I've also tried to be as concise as possible as well, just so I can get this information to yourself within 30 minutes or more. Thank you for your time. If you have any questions, please leave a comment. Don't forget to subscribe, and you can find me on my LinkedIn account, is where I'm most active, as well as Twitter. Again, hope you enjoyed this, and let me know if you'd like me to explain anything else in a more video, if it's a bit more information. Thanks again.